Hi all, so today we talk a bit about the Crusader states and in particular about the Kingdom of Jerusalem that was indeed the most important of the Crusader states that had been created at the end or during at least the First Crusade, and which presents probably many of the characteristics that can be extended also to the other entities like the Principality of Antioch, the County of Edessa, and the County of Tripoli, for instance. And being the most important, it also played obviously a major role within the relatively brief existence of these um, states of Outre-mer, so beyond the sea, as they were called in French. That was the mainly spoken language there, and we're gonna address today a problem, obviously, that is, what were the major characteristics, first of all, of the statal structure of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, and and how eventually these characteristics brought to the same failure of the Crusader experience in that kingdom, but as I was saying before, the same thing can be extended also to the other Crusader states in general. Talking about the Kingdom of Jerusalem because it was the most structured one, if anything, because it gravitated in fact around a very big center like the one of Jerusalem was. Jerusalem was one of those cities, coming, directly from the Hellenistic times as one of the major cities of the Mediterranean, just like Rome or Constantinople. Also, Antioch was one of them. Not surprisingly, was the capital of the normal Principality of Antioch. In fact, um, and Jerusalem was definitely the largest city within the Crusader states, and it was a city proper. I'm no expert about archaeology or nor about urban development into the Near East, and especially in these major cities, but Jerusalem was a city proper, a very large one for those times, which also presented some problems in a certain way, because one thing is protecting a city and another thing is protecting, something that is closer to a rock or a berg. It's something that has to be logistically maintained and also controlled, broadly speaking, relatively to the population, and so on. And certain characteristics that eventually made the Kingdom of Jerusalem fall. That we don't have to look at that simply as a military thing, but you can argue that this whole kingdom as a system hadn't been able to reach to fulfill its potential, because this is what I really want to talk about on the long run. And the reasons were, in a certain sense, genetic. I mean, they started from the very foundation of the kingdom. So as we were saying, Jerusalem had fallen at the end of the First Crusade, so at the very end of the 11th century, and it was conquered by the Duke, nobleman, Belgian nobleman, Godfrey of Bouillon. Mm? The First Crusade is famous because it wasn't attended by any king at that time, so there were essentially still high nobility, but not of royal lineage. And this is important in some ways. One might wonder what the consequences would have been, and how different it would have been for kings to have conquered the Crusader states and to observe which kind of different institutional asset or at least relation the with the European kingdoms this could bring to. And Godfrey of Bouillon was incidentally a very, seemingly according to tradition, a very humble man. When he conquered Jerusalem, he saw that as a very blessed affair, because independently of how you can look at that from a spiritual point of view, it was really a miracle that that the Crusaders made it up to Jerusalem and even made it were capable of conquering that. The first crusade was an incredible logistical success in a certain way that showed, obviously there are reasons for this, that showed a certain advancement of Western warfare at that time, and something that had largely formed on its own back in Europe, and that responded quite well at the contact with the Muslim armies and political entities in the Near East. So Godfrey was quite thankful of having conquered Jerusalem. He had, and he was offered the crown of this kingdom that had been founded, as a matter of fact, over Jerusalem. And he was so humble and Christianly meant also in such a way that that he refused the title of king. He refused the crown, answering something. I'm paraphrasing that because I don't remember the exact words, but essentially he said that he couldn't wear a royal crown in the same place, where Jesus had worn a crown of splints. So something very something very humble indeed, and therefore this brought thorns. I'm sorry, splint is something different, but you know what I mean. And this obviously marked in a certain way the first address of this kingdom that wasn't meant to be particularly authoritarian. Godfrey obtained the title of advocatus, so in Latin it would be advocate, that literally means someone who is called to do something, and of advocatus of the Holy Sepulchre, and when he immediately right after he had conquered Jerusalem, and these entity began, it was a quite a quite desired and craved dominion, like in the Near East at that time, especially the popes would see that a very good opportunity to take such kingdom in the name of Rome. However, the Baldwin, the brother of Godfrey, managed to neutralize the power of the papal nuncius, the papal legate. Nuncius wasn't there yet. Who was called Dibert, who had tried to to the Church of Rome. Dibert was, by the way, a Pisan bishop, the bishop of Pisa, in fact. That tells you how influent the Italian maritime republics at that time were in the environment of the Crusader states. As a matter of fact, the same Jerusalem had been conquered thanks to the wood of the peasant ships that had been cut down and rebuilt as siege towers to take Jerusalem. In fact, the same Godfrey of Bouillon had made writing, I don't remember exactly where, but somewhere important in Jerusalem, something like, this place belonged to the peasants because it had been conquered thanks to them, and eventually his successor would make that race to show there was ruling seemingly with an iron fist. But this iron fist, as we will be seeing, was quite low in power, as a matter of fact. And however, Baldwin, so uh, the brother of Godfrey, managed to tie to the swords of the kingdom of Jerusalem also those Frankish princes of Syria that had created their own crusader states over there. So in the north of the kingdom of Jerusalem, that was obviously hopefully something good to do, because we would think that crusader states would be solidal with each other, but as a matter of fact, there were a lot of rivalries, and sometimes they even allied with with the Byzantines, or even with the same Muslims against each other. However, there was a formal, as I was saying, there was a formal oath, sworn oath at the beginning, in which the king of Jerusalem obtained the at least the nominal fealty of all the other crusaders crusader states, and this could be a promising beginning, but from a strictly political and institutional point of view, the Kingdom of Jerusalem didn't manage to become a territorial and statal organism of great solidity. It wasn't definitely not a robust political entity, and it was proved by the fact that it couldn't last over a long time, and in which especially the royal power, so the central one that had to take the lead in this process of progressive structuration and consolidation of power, was actually becoming dependent from a certain point onwards on the local aristocracy, so a kind of elective system that obviously favored all these minor lords to whom had been entrusted their feudal dominions within the Palestinian lands, and this was really really a waste if you really think about it, because the Kingdom of Jerusalem had a huge potential, and especially from a geographical point of view that influenced strategy quite a lot at that point, especially considering the technology and the logistics of those times. It was the Kingdom of Jerusalem had a freaking good position where it was built, and especially because it was relatively well shielded by other entities for many reasons. First of all, it had an access to the sea, which was a barrier. The Saracens, telling the truth, at a certain point began to build up a navy to exactly because of the kingdom's presence in there. So to ravage the coasts, and we're talking from Egypt, and engaging against the let's say the Crusader ships, that the Crusader navy that was made up largely of Italian ships, which was something interesting, especially in the history of the Egyptian of Fatimid and Ayyubid Egypt, because The This is a time in medieval history where in which there weren't really permanent standing navies at that time. So it's very interesting that a power like Egypt that was largely focused on land operations, even against the same kingdom of Jerusalem, would build up a navy to go against Jerusalem, but obviously also the sea in this sense helped the kingdom to be defended. And as far as I remember, the Saracens didn't have huge fortunes at sea against the Italian galleys at that point. Although they were a problem also because these galleys that were built in turn by the Egyptians were growing in number. And it's very interesting also relatively to naval warfare of that time, to consider that when eventually Jerusalem fell into the hands of Saladin, um, the Egyptians immediately disbanded their fleet. So that tells you how these navies were built really for contingent reasons, and they wouldn't. Also because once the Egyptians reconquered Jerusalem, to whom they had, it was formerly one of their own dominions that they had conquered. Um, they had this major land power, and there was no need to build to keep up a fleet over the ports that they already got from land. So if anything, it was the Christians would at that point would try to harass them from the sea. Jaffa was the main port of the kingdom of Jerusalem, and eventually in the same Palestine as a region under the Muslim rulers. However, an access to the sea is always good. Also for logistical reasons, it could receive helps from the outside, from Christian Europe, indeed, and that did good also to trade, obviously. And as we've seen, it was also a barrier in some ways. People like to stress the fact that the sea is always, connecting, and this is definitely true. The Mediterranean at that point was really a highway uh, for towards very far away lands. Land routes were much more expensive and risky and dangerous in many ways. Going with wind power, floating over the waves is definitely a much easier um, and convenient, especially task in spite of all the risks that also that implied. But the sea can become also a barrier, indeed. Christians and Muslims, and even Christians and Muslims kept killing each other in the Mediterranean for millennia, you can say, from a millennium and something else, I would say. So you can argue that it was some form of barrier as well. Um, the kingdom of Jerusalem in the north and the east had also mountains that obviously were also another good obstacle for the armies of the time, and the desert which is not easy to cross definitely in any way, and that considering the logistics of that time was really sometimes not even conceivable as land of transit, at least from the perspective of large armies, or at least if one had to cross the desert, there was a huge logistical effort. So that desert was good for brigands and other um, other um, other forms of operation that were mostly proper of the nomadic tribes that inhabited the desert at that time, and not for large armies of sedentary civilizations like the one of the Crusaders, or even the one of Muslim Egypt could be, in spite of, being more or less adapt to the climate, but humans at the end of the day are made up in the same way, so you can have an experience in a certain environment that obviously pays off, but not necessarily this means that you have to think of the Muslims so expert in desert warfare, because the same logistical problems that they face were the one faced by the Crusaders. And another interesting point that has more to do with the political map at that point of the Near East is definitely the fact that the Kingdom of Jerusalem didn't communicate directly with the Byzantine Empire. Now, the Byzantine Empire at this point was quite active. It would be until its destruction in 1204. So actually the Kingdom of Jerusalem survived the Byzantine Empire, but this was still a very formidable opponent for the time he was present there, and there was a lot of political gaming between Jerusalem and Constantinople for relatively to the wall area. Even a small shift in alliances and meant to really change the whole game, which was complicated, especially by the feudal nature of these Crusader kingdoms that obviously heavily it was also a Byzantine problem, telling the truth. But there were a lot of dynastic led political events, meaning that a certain marriage that maybe was necessary because of things happening in Europe rather than in the Near East within the houses of Jerusalem and some other Crusader state would change the whole situation with the Egyptians, with the Turks in Anatolia, and with the Byzantines. It was a very fluid area, and these major powers like the Byzantine Empire would have a lot of influence, but on the local political affairs. But the fact of having, of not being in direct contact at the border with this Byzantine giant was definitely an advantage with the for the Kingdom of Jerusalem, that could instead play on the other Crusader states that were in the middle, and that helped a lot. And not even with and it was not even in contact with the Cilician Armenians that were a power that had been created when the Seljuk Turks had invaded Armenia, pushing part of the Armenians to take refuge in Cilicia. That this region between Turkey and Syria, essentially, that has an access to the sea, and that was quite a dynamic power, and it also played quite sneakily between alliances with first with the Byzantines, then with the Crusader states, and even with the Turks sometimes, and was a quite dangerous power. So also this power was and against which the Crusaders fought was not in direct contact with the Kingdom of Jerusalem. And so you see that, looking at the map, the Kingdom of Jerusalem was in a pretty good situation. The real problem, however, were internal affairs and internal organization of the conquered lands. Because one thing you can do is going to a place and enforcing power with your military resources. Make deterrents. You can keep the subjects obedient and so on. But first of all, you have to assure yourself that your military is efficient, it can be battle ready, and being effective against any threat. As I was saying, the political situation was constantly changing, so there would be enemies, everywhere. You had to counter, and you necessarily needed, as king of Jerusalem, of substantial forces to defend your domains. Um, and the real problem at this point was that the economical structures of the Kingdom of Jerusalem were asphyctic, substantially, extremely weak. And this is, maybe I will make a dedicated video about it more in depth one day, but this was at large the problem of Crusader states, that when they were created they weren't able to really create a different order from the one they had brought from feudal Europe. That was definitely well working at the time in the old continent, but in the Near East needed at least some substantial transformation to be successfully replicated. Um, because you see, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, and, as well as the other Crusader states, didn't have much problems relatively to trade. These were kingdoms that were obviously being conquered also for economical reasons. It goes without saying that they were in a central position between East and West. The Italian maritime republics were since long time on the Syrian and Palestinian coast during the Muslim times, and what the Crusaders did, by the way, thanks to the same interest of the Italian city-states, was to conquer those lands and to grant access to these Italian merchants that also provided, as we have said, the naval power to these Crusader kingdoms, and therefore it was quite considering the geographical position and the presence of Italian merchants coming from Genoa, Pisa, and Venice, etc. Trade was fine. Goods passed. There was definitely some income. I have no idea of how to quantify that, but surely the Crusaders made a living, partly also and greatly of that. But trade wasn't the major. You can't really create a kingdom that is based only on trade, unless it's not surprisingly, the Italian city-states were city-states. They weren't kingdoms like the ones in the Near East had been created. So especially to keep up a very strong heavy cavalry, typical of the European military, was something that demanded a lot of resources coming from the land. And this was the major weakness of the Crusader states. It was very difficult, essentially, to make a restart after the conquest of the Muslim lands, agriculture, and especially it was very difficult to once that was achieved, to make it more potent, economically speaking, to give a boost to it and to expand into building something more structural. First of all, you have to consider that the what could be the Palestinian countryside was very different from the one from which these French, Belgian crusaders had come. Those were lands in Europe that were extremely deeply feudalized. There was a world society that had been structured over the centuries to, provide, to sustain that military elite that had come in the Near East, conquering the Muslim lands. Um, but in Muslim lands there wasn't something like that. The Muslim lands, especially at this time, had already, I think, a lower economical productivity than the one at least of Western Europe, um, especially in terms of agriculture. There were especially the distribution of lands was quite different. While in Europe a lot of lands were concentrated in the hands of a very few guys that made up the the military elite and the nobility, Muslim lands were, in a certain sense, divided in a much more egalitarian way. There was much more small and middle size land property. It wasn't a feudal system like the one we could see in Europe. I think just in Persia or certain Turkish lands you could find something similar. Not surprisingly, the Muslims lacked the numbers and probably even the quality of heavy cavalry that the Europeans could display. Um, and therefore it wasn't probably even a matter of local resources being presented there, but it was really the whole society that wasn't structured in order to sustain that social model that the Crusaders tried to impose on them. And another problem, another plague that afflicted the Kingdom of Jerusalem, like other areas of the Near East, were brigands. Was the presence of martyrs that probably had always been there. I don't know how much of that was related to resistance of the locals against the Christians. I don't think there was such a very strong hostility from that point of view. We have seen that Palestine is this frontier land between, the sedentary areas of the Mediterranean world and the desertic or semi-arid areas of more resembling the Arabian landscape than the one of the Mediterranean. And in the latter, you have obviously nomadism, pastoralism, and a phenomenon like the ones of of banditry and brigandage were probably quite extensive, especially over the caravans that crossed regularly, I'd say, um, those very lands. And indeed, banditry was a problem in general in medieval societies all over the world, and you can find them usually where there is a weak central power, essentially, which was the case of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Um, and they were these phenomena were very difficult to eradicate, indeed, because uh, you need someone who knows the territory, who is skilled at that type of warfare. And normally the European knights weren't, because yeah, they were good at raiding, but good at raiding in big fashion, in very fertile areas where you could go with an army and staying there for a long time and persuading the enemy not to attack you because you were still a quite strong force to meet in open ground. Instead, this banditry was very scattered, and sending a heavy knight that probably had a very few guys next to them because the the potential of these lands, as we've seen, was quite poor. So the kingdom never deployed more than, I think, a couple of hundreds of heavy knights, um, at least, without counting the lighter cavalry, like the one of the squires, etc. Weren't really the best troops to be sent into the desert, hunting um, from light cavalry that could easily surround them and or at least escape to them. That's not what a medieval knight was supposed to do. That was a type of fighter mainly suited for fighting in very thick, compact formations in ranks, in major pitched battles. You don't send the elite to do things like trying to 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 drive away and shoo bandits across the desert. So there wasn't much of a response at that point. However, it should be mentioned that probably, especially the feudal lords that inhabited, the lands along across Palestine, and that therefore, as lords would rule over peripheral lands that maybe were and probably were more afflicted by this form of banditry, we're probably adapting in a certain measure to this kind of warfare, and we must think that the same crusaders from the kingdom of Jerusalem did send indeed um, um, some groups of knights making raids and banditry as well into for instance, the Egyptian border. A very famous figure in this is Rainald of Chatillon, who was a French who went into the kingdom of Jerusalem um, at a certain point. It has a very interesting and movimented life. That at a certain point began to build a sort of lordship on his own, in expanding the territories of the kingdom of Jerusalem up to the Red Sea, over which he would even take up ships to raid the Egyptian in the Egyptian coasts along the Red Sea, which was something fantastic. So you can't really understand how even Westerners were capable of adapting to that environment and being quite inventive and successful. Reinald of Chatillon, by the way, was also a diplomatical problem, because the kingdom of Jerusalem at a certain point would try also to maintain good relationship with the Egyptians, and these feudal lords that depended on the king, but basically did most of the times whatever they wanted, would cause diplomatical crisis by crossing the border and making a mess in in the from the Egyptian side. Um, and, and we must say, obviously, that the only way to probably the major element that could make the success of a kingdom like the one of Jerusalem wasn't much this military elite that obviously was necessary in warfare, but as we have seen, there were economical resources, social resources that could support that, and that is probably the main problem of the Crusader states, is that the um, the so-called Latin people that came. Latin was a term that was used to define broadly the Europeans, often the French, sometimes the Italians, but it was a very broad term used in the Near East. So when you say the Latins at this point, you don't have to think about anything very specific, or, in this sense. So a great number of people coming from effectively from various countries that had joined um, the Crusaders since the beginning of their enterprise, and that had settled into these newly created Christian states. For the Kingdom of Jerusalem, we can estimate them at 10,000 people. So you see very contained numbers of civilians. So we're essentially talking about Christian civilians. That included, a very heterogeneous, very heterogeneous kinds of people. We're talking about vagabonds, or monks, poor priests, or even serfs, and colons that were brought by the same knights from Europe to serve and to assist them, obviously, in this journey. And that tells you how medieval knights, in order to exist, required a whole system to support them, to feed them, to keep them, etc. That obviously, at this point, you understand, would make the difference, at least relatively to the possibility of maintaining and sustaining a very strong military elite in order to expand the kingdom. And these people, they settled into the Near East within these Crusader states, but they were quite volatile. There weren't people who could be. First of all, there weren't many, as we've seen. Secondly, some of them were freemen, so there were people who could come back to Europe, and this is something that you can obviously understand, because people would leave Europe for reaching the Holy Land, but at a certain point, once their mission was accomplished, they would come back by large. Other people would remain, but seemingly there were quite few.